Hello, YouTube. This is UMills03. This lesson 10 is in regard to if statements and control flow. Sometimes we want the output of our program to depend on the truth value of booleans. And if something is true, we want our program to behave a particular way. Otherwise, something else could happen. So for example, if it's cold outside, I'll bundle up. Otherwise, maybe not. And computer programs have this same kind of logic where they can evaluate these Booleans, and output can be different according to just what the truth value of these Booleans are. So let's take a look at the code that we have here. We essentially have a little bit of Boolean algebra examples here. So we essentially have A is true and B is false. Simple enough, right? This is declaration and initialization. This step is just declaration. So we've declared 5 Boolean variables in the first 2 lines. We've only initialized 2. So we have 5 Booleans, A, B, C, D, and E, and we know 2 of them, 3 of them are undefined. But C gets defined for the first time. That's called initialization. So it says A or B. True or false evaluates to true, as we remember from lesson 8, a little bit of lesson 9, but probably mostly lesson 8 that we were talking about that. And then D equals A and B, so true and false. Anything, if false is ANDed with anything, it's false, okay? But if true is ORed with anything, then it's true, okay? So essentially, the false is a disqualifier of the and the true is a qualifier of the or, if that makes sense. But the string F is foxes. And so now we have a review of lesson 6, which is where we talked about string methods. So hopefully you're comfortable enough with what substring does here. So G equals F dot substring of 0. So what does that print? That essentially, so G would be foxes here. So it would start at the index position 0 and return the substring with all characters starting at index position 0. So it'd be FOXES. And then essentially H, and remember that if you specify 2 arguments, the first one is the index position of where you start, and the second one is the first index position that you don't include. So what's f dot length over 2? Well, f dot length is 5. 5 over 2, remember we said an integer divided by an integer is an integer in Java, so 5 over 2 is 2. And so this would be from 0 to 2. So we're looking at the first 2 letters, okay? So we're looking at F and O, okay? So H equals fo, okay? And so essentially it says if C. So this says if this Boolean, if the Boolean here in question is true. This is how this works. So this could be anything you wanted true. We could have said if true, and it would operate the same way. If we said if 9 plus 1 equals 10, that would end up operating the same way, because the fact of the matter is the code that was here originally, we had a Boolean C here, and C is true. So any other true Boolean would cause this code, the things are going to operate in the same way, because we have if C, which it is. So we are going to operate the code here in the purple box. These are purple boxes on BlueJ. So it says system.out.println of g.toString. Recall that calling the toString method on a string object just returns that string object, just the letters of it. So g.toString will just be foxes. So this would print foxes if C is true, which it is. And then at the bottom, we have another line of code here, which says regardless, system.out.println of regardless, this is at the bottom. So now what we could compile, and hopefully you can predict that we would have foxes and regardless this is at the bottom. So essentially now we can go ahead and do that. And we have to find the console output, which is right here. And so we have foxes and regardless this is at the bottom, okay? But then what if we had reversed the value of C? So in between these 2 strings, just for fun, it doesn't really matter where we do it, but the value of C is true at this point right here that's being highlighted. So now what if we say C is not C? It's like flipping a light switch, right? If it's on, you turn it off. If it's off, you turn it on. Take the value of it and just do make it the opposite. So now do we get foxes? Hopefully you can predict that we do not get any foxes, okay? Because that boolean is no longer true. If we want to have code that runs alternatively if the boolean fails, we apply an else statement. So else, for a simple if-else block, else runs if and only if does not run. So if the that boolean up there is false, if that boolean up there that you're seeing C is false, then the else code runs, okay, but not the if code. But if C is true, then the if code runs, but not the else code. So we'll say something like system.out.println of true.length plus false.length. Okay, just because we're talking about booleans. So obviously this would be 4 plus 5. Okay, so this would be 9. So essentially, and then if we make either of those a double, then this whole thing becomes a 9.0. Okay, so now what happens is we're going to go ahead and run this code. We get the 9.0. And so this, and then it's after the end of the if statement, we're going to come down here regardless. Okay, so whenever you finish an if statement or a switch statement, which is what we're going to be talking about next lesson, lesson 11, or a while loop, which is what we're going to be talking about in lesson 12, or a for loop, which is what we're going to be talking about in lesson 13. Once you finish it, you will poop down to the bottom of it. Okay, you will get down to the bottom of it. So system.out.println of regardless, this is at the bottom. Okay, so that's how this works. So now what we're going to do is we're going to have a different example. So let's keep these booleans in here. These are looking pretty good. So now we're going to say, so look, it looks like C is still false. So here's what happens if else if 5 equals 7 minus 2, system.out.println of 7 plus 2 is 10. Okay. So what happens here is there are two expressions to evaluate. So if you have an if, else if, it will check the first boolean. If the first boolean is true, it runs this first section of code and not the second. If the first boolean is false, it checks the second boolean. At that point, if the second boolean is true, it just runs the second section. If the second boolean is false, it just comes right out of here. Okay, it just comes out of the block. So this is what would happen here. So it just evaluates two different booleans. Okay, but if the first one is true, it doesn't check the second one. These are not independent if statements. The only way that the second one even gets evaluated is if the first one fails. So never would you have both of these statements running. In fact, neither of them will run if both of the booleans fails. Okay, so now we would print, what would we print? We would print false, because 7 plus 2 is not 10, but C was false and 5 is 7 minus 2. And now we don't have, I took out that sentence at the bottom. So now we'll probably just print one thing this time. So essentially if we run the main method, we just print the false, okay? But now what if we run a not here? Else if it's not the case that 5 is 7 minus 2. So now both of these booleans are false. And now if we compile and run it, we have blank. There's nothing to print because both of these booleans failed. What if we have and then, so obviously, and then these things can be evaluated independently as well. So, so you can get the sense of what would happen here, right? So, if true, what about else if true? And then so here, only the first one runs. So if you say a block, right? So here, you're not going to print hey and block. You would only print hey, okay? And then if you said something like, what if you take out the else here? Then what prints? Then you can go ahead and compile it. And now you get hey and block because these are evaluated independently. What if we have an if, else if, else? I guess that's probably the only type that we haven't talked about yet. So if we have an if, else if, else. Okay, so let's go back to our original booleans So if we have elseif, let's do A. Otherwise, system.out.println of French fries gets soggy quickly. Okay, so essentially, we're going to compile this code and think about what happens here. So if C is true, we print hey, and we forget the rest of all this. We just print hey. If C is false, we evaluate A. If A is true, we just evaluate the second block and not the first block or the third block. If A is false at that point, so now at this point, if C is false and at that point now after that A is false too, then you say French fries get soggy quickly. So here we know that C is still false, right? Because we flipped it to be false here. C is false. So we're not going to get a hey, but we are going to get a block because A is literally true. So now if we go ahead and compile this, then we go ahead and run the main method and we get the block, okay? Now what if we go ahead and say otherwise if not A? So here now we're going to have two false booleans, right? Because C is false because we took a true boolean and we inverted it, and not A is false because A is true. Okay, we haven't inverted A, we haven't changed the value of A, except in this local setting. Okay, but we haven't. But if we print A, down here below the if, it's still going to be true. But we're evaluating not A, and not A is false. So we don't get a hey, we don't get a block, and now what are we going to get? We're going to get French fries get soggy quickly. French fries get soggy quickly. And you can have as many elseifs as you want, and your else condition is optional. You don't have to have a, default if all else fails. That's what it means. It means else, like all else fails, okay? It prints something in the, if there's this probability that, one of your if booleans works, then everything else is your else work, so something is going to be printed if you have a println in all of your blocks here. Okay, so if you say elseif, you could have another boolean that you check for. So what if you say otherwise if false? Now you just have another false one. So is this one going to print? What if we say 67 plus 10? Is it going to print 77? No, because you just have another false boolean here. What if you have a true here? Okay, so then what if you say system.out.println of 50 minus 4? Is it going to print 46? Yes, because it finally found one that was true. And you could have other ones that are true underneath it. 5 plus 5 is less than 277,000. Is 5 plus 5 less than 277,000? Yes. And so we could say system.out.println dog, of dog, right? So would this print dog even though this boolean is true? No, because we're going to run down the line here and we're just looking for the first time that something is true. We know that we're going to get there if we have an else condition. We don't know that we're going to get there if we don't have an else condition. If the first thing is true, you run this first block of code and then you forget everything else. If the first thing is false, the second thing is false, the third thing is false, but the fourth thing is true, then you run the fourth block of code and then nothing else, okay? So that's kind of how this works, and then you will always come down here. So even if you didn't have an else, and even if all of these booleans failed, you will still print whatever's down here. You still get to the end of the program. So you can see all of these booleans are false here. So if we say not true, what about if we say not true and true? So this is a false boolean. So you should be familiar with that. And then we go ahead and compile it, and then we can run the main method. And we just get end, right? Because literally all these booleans failed and there's no else. So hopefully that kind of summarizes how some of these things work. And hopefully you are ready for the next video where we'll be talking about the switch statement, which is sort of an alternative to using if and else if. It's a slightly different way of doing things. So from UMILSO3, thanks for watching and please subscribe.